I'm Robert Hazel from the Constitution Unit, chairing tonight's seminar, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome Mike Russell, MSP, who's the Minister in the Scottish Government for External Affairs and the Constitution, a portfolio he's held since February of this year. And he's therefore been charged by Alex Salmond with leading the national conversation in Scotland about their constitutional future, which I think is what you're going to talk about tonight. Mike, you're enormously welcome here in London. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I, like all sensible Scottish Government ministers who are making wise use of taxpayers' money, I've done lots of other things today as well. But I am very much looking forward to debating and discussing with you the issue of Scotland's constitutional future. What I intend to do is to set out the scene in the next 20 minutes or so, but I suspect the real meat of what we're going to do will result from the discussion that we have. Being here in London brings home to me the fact that the changing constitutional arrangements for Scotland are bound to have and will have a profound impact on the other parts of the UK. Now, no one, not even my best friend or my worst enemy, would call me a closet nationalist. But whilst I believe that independence offers great opportunities for all the countries of the UK, I do accept that some do not hold that view. So what we're engaged with is truly a national conversation, both in Scotland and elsewhere, the opportunity to discuss what we think, all of us think, all those people who live in Scotland and all those who have an interest in what's happening in Scotland, we think should happen in Scotland and how Scotland should change and evolve. I am quite convinced there is a growing appetite for change in Scotland. I also believe that there is a growing appetite for independence in Scotland. But I also believe that that process of change is not just about redrawing borders. It is not just about government. It's also about governance. And I want to say a word or two about that before I fully start. I think there's little enthusiasm in Scotland, and I would not have any great enthusiasm, for changing constitutional arrangements that simply leave the process of governance as it is. I would look to the Scottish Parliament as it has developed over the last 10 years, and I'm very proud to have been a founding member of the Parliamentary Bureau that put in place the arrangements for that Parliament, and indeed was the member that took through the expenses scheme at the very beginning. I think the Scottish Parliament has shown how it is possible to develop different ways of doing things. In fact, I think the Scottish Parliament has adopted ways of working that are much more connected with, are much more relevant to the people it serves. Now, no process is final, complete, or perfect. There's clearly more to be done to restore the proper connection between the Parliament and the people. But I believe that that work cannot be taken forward without further change of the constitutional arrangements. So I connect in my own mind, and I think increasingly people in Scotland connect in their minds, the process of constitutional change and the process of how government is delivered and how people are governed. In that sense, to me, independence for Scotland is a major opportunity for democratic renewal, and an opportunity that by definition would apply north and south of the border. I believe that the process that we're engaged in is a process, and it will continue to move forward. And that process is at the heart not just of the structures of government, but of the whole business of how we are governed. Now, within that context, within that process of change, which is not simply about borders or what used to be called in the early days of the SNP, the epaulets on the uniforms, it is about the whole relationship between the citizen and the state and how that changes and develops. So with that as a context, I want to lay out a number of things tonight. I want first of all to talk about the history of the constitutional question. I want to talk about the case for Scotland accepting responsibility. I want to mention other changing perspectives on the constitutional arrangement, including the report of the Common Commission, the response to which the Scottish Government issued today. And I want to take that issue forward through the national conversation to the referendum which the Scottish Government intends to hold in 2010. Now, of course, Scotland and England have a long, complex, but shared history. Of course, it's been a history characterised by violent events, rebellion, war, assassinations, but the constitutional changes have come through evolution rather than revolution. The only really revolutionary change, the enforced union, enforced by Cromwell, really a military occupation, lasted a mere 8 years before it was dissolved. And I think in the light of that shared experience, there are some people who would want to go a step further and to say that the proper history of these islands suggests that there is some form of magical process, magical predetermined progress to a single nation state in this island. Well, I don't think that's true. I think there have been and continue to be shifting relationships. And I think what we see here is not the inevitability of a single polity, but a useful divergence and a useful difference. Before the Union, there were two kingdoms. Their histories were certainly interleaved at all points, but the reality was of two realms, two sovereigns, and two nations, and two parliaments. And of course, since 1999, there have again been two parliaments. In Scotland, the first record of what we might understand as a parliament dates from 1235. The parliaments in those days met when the king decreed. But parliaments could, and in the case of Scotland did, from time to time, stand up against dictate. In 1364, the Scottish Parliament stood up to David II over his proposal to make Edward III of England or his children heir to the Scottish throne. That followed the small matter of an unpaid ransom from David's release from captivity in England. And in 1560, elements of the nobility in Parliament turned to England again against the Regent of Scotland, Mary of Guise, mother, of course, of Mary, Queen of Scots. And the resulting Treaty of Edinburgh needs to be thought of, its anniversary, of course, lies next year, needs to be thought of as a seminal moment in the changing relationship that Scotland has had with its southern neighbour. The treaty ended the old alliance of France, secured the Reformation in Scotland, but most importantly, for the first time, established what you could call a positive relationship north and south of the border. Now, history moves on, but the history from 1560 was a process of growing together. To go into the details of the National Covenant, the Protectorate, the Restoration, the Convention, all those things are a little complex for here. But I think what one can see is a growing together, first of all, in the person of the monarch, and then a growing together of the parliaments, even if the final growing together, the Treaty and Acts of Union of 1707, were without doubt a bought treaty, and one in which one remembers the words of a leading Scottish historian commenting upon those who brought it to place. Few countries have been cursed by such selfish and treacherous nobles as Scotland. First, the separate thrones and kingdoms of England and Scotland were united, and then the parliaments were united. But an important detail, the old sovereign parliaments of England and Scotland were both abolished. A new parliament came into being, and it is that new parliament that still exists. The old parliaments do not exist. The new parliament does exist. But the potential exists, of course, of recreating either or both of those parliaments. What took their place, of course, in 1707 were new institutions. But in Scotland, some of the institutions pre-Union were preserved. Existing institutions, the law and the courts, the Scottish Privy Council, although that did not last for long, and by way of a separate act of the old Scottish Parliament, the established church. So at one level you had the new nation. At the other level you had continuing forms of government, though those forms of government now lacked democratic accountability or legitimacy, even if perhaps that concept is a different one then. And since 1707, the Union has developed and responded to changing social, economic and political circumstances. But not consistently, and not without question, and perhaps in the last 100 years or so, perhaps not so much progressed, has begun to unravel. Because pressure for Home Rule in Scotland followed almost from the inception of the Union. Some of the more romantic or dramatic episodes, understand in that way, perhaps were less to do with the Union and more to do with dynastic ambition. But the foundation of the Association of Vindication of Scottish Rights in the mid-1850s, then the establishment of the Office of Secretary of State for Scotland in 1885, were examples of desire for change. So was also Keir Hardie's platform in the famous Mid-Atlantic by-election of 1888, which for the first time was a platform of Home Rule. And the idea of Home Rule began to gain force from that time. The Scottish Office transferred from London to Edinburgh in 1939. Various departments for Home Affairs, Education, Agriculture and Fisheries were formed. The Permanent Civil Service also grew. But there was no democratic accountability. Despite the fact that a Home Rule bill reached its second reading, one of several, but the only one to reach its second reading before the First World War, the institutions of the British state prevailed right through the First World War, the Second World War, and into the establishment of the welfare state. And one can really date the modern constitutional argument to 1967, to the triumph of Winnie Ewing in the Hamilton by-election, and the emergence of a particular Scottish campaign for democratic accountability, to match the administrative devolution that was in existence, to add to it a democratic element. It might be important just to point out what that movement was and what distinguished it from other national movements, perhaps in Europe and elsewhere. It wasn't, from its foundation in political form in 1934, but earlier in the form of perhaps looking as far back as the Society for the Vindication of Scottish Rights. It wasn't an ethnic, linguistic, or cultural movement. It was an inclusive and civic movement. Certainly it had cultural elements. At some wilder times, it may even have had linguistic elements. But it was an inclusive and civic nationalism, based on the inhabitants of Scotland, based on the institutions of Scotland, and based on the development of the constitutional and governmental mechanisms. And that's an interesting note to have. It wasn't about overthrowing those mechanisms, it was about developing those mechanisms, and developing them through constitutional means. Parties standing in Westminster elections, pressing for legislation at Westminster, campaigning through the normal, at that stage, Westminster political process. And the high point before the current Scottish Parliament was the Scotland Act of 1978, which would have set up a legislative assembly in Edinburgh, but the referendum of 1979 did not achieve the unusual but required target of 40% of those registered to vote. Now, the legitimacy of that legislative requirement can be and has been questioned. But the issue of Home Rule certainly took a blow from the result. And that blow took some time to recover from. I think the sign of recovery comes in the Claim of Rights signed by many Scottish MPs in 1989, though I will point out before anybody else is that did not include the SNP MPs, as a convention that followed did not consider independence. Perhaps Calman was a case of history repeating itself in those circumstances, because independence was also excluded from its remit. And of course, coming through the Scotland Act of 1998, which was supported, of course, by the SNP, and then the 1997 referendum, starting the process, a pre-legislative referendum, starting the process of confirming that the settled will of the Scottish people needed to be followed. And of course, on 1st July 1999, the Scottish Parliament was fully vested with its powers. Not the independence Parliament that myself and others would have been seeking, but supported by the nationalist movement because it was an important step. Those of you who are familiar with Winnie Ewing's biography, and if you're not familiar with it, I would suggest you read it as I edited it, has a story in it where she was racked with some doubt in 1968 when there were discussions taking place about whether the SNP should support constitutional change, devolution as constitutional change. And she raised this issue with Gwynfor Evans, who was the leader of the Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist Party. And he said to her, the answer, Winnie, is very simple. If my people are starving and they're offered half a loaf, then I will make sure that they have bread to eat. A rather dramatic and Welsh way of putting it, but certainly a point to make. And the SNP has, I think, consistently or almost consistently followed the view that incremental progress is, after all, progress. The support, I should also say here, for the referendum in 1997 was predicated upon a clear indication from Donald Dewar, at that stage Secretary of State, that there would be no glass ceiling in terms of the Scottish Parliament. And that is, nothing explicit within the Scotland Act would prevent the Scottish Parliament from moving on. An important issue we might want to address later on. So we come to the Scottish Parliament. And can I say that even though it's not an independent Parliament, I'm very proud to have been a member of it, proud to have been a founding member of the Bureau, even proud to have been one of the members who lost their seat in 2003 and returned in 2007 and came into government. It has been a parliament of optimism, even at its worst moments. Donald Dewar said at the opening of the parliament 10 years ago, it's a rare privilege in an old nation to open a new parliament. And the new parliament gave Scotland the opportunity to have a fresh start. And the people of Scotland have used that fresh start in a variety of different ways over the 10 years. MSPs, I think, are more directly accountable than ever, as they should be. And the establishment of the Parliament was not just about accountability and physical proximity, in that phrase of Scott, so that the people could pibble us with stains so when we are nae good bairns, but it's also about a confidence within Scotland, a determination that we can make decisions for ourselves and we learn by making them. A Parliament suitable for the 21st century, and a Parliament that begins to examine and exercise the issues of sovereignty in Scotland and the different concept of sovereignty that exists in Scotland than in south of the border. And a Parliament that, as I said earlier, developed different methods of doing things and different types of governance. The Parliament's founding structures encourage transparency, cooperation and inclusivity. And those principles underpin everything that the Parliament has achieved. Openness and inclusivity is also something that we would like to see characterise the relationship between the devolved parliaments and the other institutions within this country. And indeed, I note the work of the Constitution Unit in talking about the structures of devolution and the need to make, for example, the joint ministerial committees more accountable, more open, more transparent. A matter which I was very happy to encourage the Common Commission to consider, and I'm glad to see that the recommendations that they have made on that are very much in accordance with the views that I hold and the Scottish Government holds. Now, the rebirth of the Parliament is an important moment for any nation. PR has been very important for the Scottish Parliament. Coalition was clearly important for the Scottish Parliament, and I would now argue that minority government is important for the Scottish Parliament. Those are all lessons that we have taken. And of course, there are many examples of action that we've taken, a whole raft of legislation going from the climate change bill, a leading climate change bill, the smoking ban, free personal care, the abolition of tuition fees, to the issues of reforming local government voting systems. A Parliament that started on a process of reform and has the time to do it, because one of the pressing issues of Westminster, certainly in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, was the fact that necessary legislative change in Scotland, even change recommended by the Scottish Law Commission, could not find an appropriate place within the legislative timetable at Westminster and was constantly delayed or set backwards. So a Parliament with the time to make change, the Parliament with the opportunity to bring change, and the Parliament that is closer to people and knows what change they wish. Those are important achievements. And I think that the Parliament has also shown, despite the political difficulties, and particularly in a time of minority government, a willingness to negotiate and compromise. Now, you hear a lot of rhetoric in the Scottish Parliament about that issue, but by and large, I think that is what you do see. Even at the very difficult time of budget setting, you get the opportunity to negotiate and to compromise. So what has the Parliament shown? It's shown that Scotland has the ability to manage its own affairs, it's shown it can make decisions, shown it can make hard choices, though those choices become harder, particularly with the enforced cut that's presently in the Scottish budget from the UK government. So we have choices to make, and I think we've shown we can make them. And I've spent most of my political life arguing that if the people of Scotland could see a Scottish government learning to govern Scotland in some things, then they would wish the Scottish government to govern in all things. And that still remains a view that I have, that the experience of government over a period of time will lead to further change. And the Parliament's success is reflected in the value people place on it. 2/3 of Scots want the Parliament to have more powers. 70% believe it should have the most influence over the way Scotland is run. But we have reached the limit of the current constitutional settlement. And that should make us think about the topic in hand. 10 years ago, very few people regarded the devolution settlement as set in stone. In fact, I think only the Labour government regarded it as set in stone. But many said it needed time to bed itself in before the further change was considered. 10 years seems to be a reasonable amount of time for bedding in. Of course, in Spain, the structure they have, the autonomous regions, there is a built-in process of review. I think that the view in Scotland is that after a decade it is time to review the settlement and to see what is now needed. And of course that is one of the things that motivated the establishment of the Common Commission. All of the main political parties, therefore, if you take the Commission as an expression of the will of the political parties, to a greater or lesser extent believe that devolution should be reconsidered and further powers should be looked at. The debate we have in Scotland is no longer whether change is needed, but what form that change should take. Now, I believe that the devolution settlement limits the powers of the Parliament and the possibilities of action in a number of significant areas. Many important issues that impact on day-to-day life in Scotland remain reserved to the UK government. Benefits, energy policy, aspects of transport, foreign affairs, defence and immigration. Indeed, I've been having discussions about immigration this afternoon. And the UK points-based system has introduced new difficulties which we need to overcome. And of course, today, highly relevant, very relevant at this moment, economic and fiscal policy. Decisions in those matters are taken remote from Scotland, not always in the interests of Scotland, and in some cases fly in the face of Scottish opinion. And indeed, I observed this at first hand in my role as External Affairs Minister when attending European councils, both in that role and as in my when I was Environment Minister, seeing decisions taken and points of view put forward which are distant from the mainstream opinion in Scotland and are distant from the policy needs that Scotland have. I always quote the issue of when I was Environment Minister attending a Fisheries Council in Luxembourg, in which the lead UK minister was a member of the House of Lords, had by his own admission never been to Luxembourg and had never been to a Fisheries Council. The main item on the agenda was the cod recovery plan, an issue which Scotland is associated with but not England. But whilst I could not speak, the Luxembourg Fisheries Minister was able to speak. That seems to me to fly in the face of sense and equity. And what we need to do is to make government more sensible, more equitable, closer to and matching better a nation of 5 million people rather than a nation of 50 million people. And that's the task that we have. But there are things that won't change if independence takes place. We all share strong social and cultural ties. I should probably admit at this stage that you're listening to a Scottish National Party member of 30 years standing, a Scottish Government Minister responsible for the Constitution, who was born in Bromley. That does prove something of a social tie. We have a shared language, and we have shared family and culture. We share traditions. We have, as I've said earlier, we share aspects of our history, and we share a commitment to justice and fairness, amongst other things. So there is the possibility of strong cooperation. What we need to do is to establish the systems and governance that allow us to go our separate ways when we need to take responsibility for the things that require change, and to respect each other in terms of different decisions we come to. For example, in our shared heritage, we have the question of the head of state, an arrangement that predates the union of the parliaments, and which we as a party, a political party and a government, are entirely comfortable with the continuation of the present arrangement. And we also believe that we would be better neighbours as members of the European Union who had individual representation than the rather surly arrangement we can have from time to time presently when we're represented in Europe. So our potential is very great. The potential for the change in relationship is great, and the potential for a new relationship is also great. Now, others do not agree with this view of how we should move forward. The Cullman Commission, set up by the opposition parties in the Scottish Parliament in association with the UK government, I believe was hamstrung by its inability to consider options for Scotland out with the current constitutional arrangements. But in issuing today our response to the Cullman Commission's report, copies of which will be available as you leave, in issuing that today, there are things with which we can agree. We think that there are recommendations within Cullman that can be taken forward reasonably quickly. And indeed, the Scottish Government has shown its willingness to do so by already tabling draft orders, which would require only actions at Westminster to take them forward. There are also issues in terms of the operation, for example, the Joint Ministerial Committees, where we're very happy to have these discussions in the existing JMC structure. And indeed, we have already raised those, and raised the first of them at the JMC plenary just over 6 weeks ago. But there are issues in which we don't agree with Cullman, and primarily on the fiscal issues. We think that the fiscal fudge, what this report recommends, would frankly be unworkable, and indeed, if instituted, would perhaps create greater difficulties than the present situation. But whilst rejecting the fiscal issues, we endorse some of the other issues, are grateful for the ideas within it, but it doesn't go far enough. We could, however, show our shared commitment, north and south of the border, to better governance in Scotland by moving ahead with it as quickly as possible in terms of those things that there is a consensus about. And I am somewhat surprised that there's a refusal to do so, because if the issue of improving governance in Scotland is a real issue, if it is the issue that we all accept it is, then we could make better progress than we've made. But how do we take our ideas forward as a government? And I want to conclude with this. Well, we've taken them forward through something called the national conversation. Now, it's been fashionable in certain parts of the Scottish Parliament to deride the national conversation as a monologue. Well, you don't get 5,000 people involved in a monologue in 50 different public events the length and breadth of Scotland. You don't get 1,000 people attending open meetings of the Cabinet with the First Minister and all the Cabinet Ministers in a monologue. And you don't get the active involvement of the voluntary sector, churches, trade unions, academics, businesses, ethnic minority groups and young people in a monologue. To deride the national conversation is to show a profound lack of respect for civic Scotland and for the range of people who have taken part in this exercise. Because what the national conversation is about an open discussion about the prospects facing Scotland. And at the end of that open discussion, there should be a conclusion. We will be publishing our next white paper on the issue on St Andrew's Day. And then we will be giving the opportunity, we hope, for the people of Scotland to express their preference. Because the basic democratic imperative is that after there have been a range of options, including the Calman options, after all these options have been put on the table, it is right that people have the choice. So our intention is to make sure that Scotland's voice can be heard. We intend to put a fairly straight choice. But of course, if there is another option, and I'm sorry that the Calman proposals have not been formulated into that option, but if there is another option, then we're very willing to consider how that could be included within the referendum. So we've got the opportunity to make sure that Scotland chooses. And in the run-up to St Andrew's Day, we've been publishing over the last 6 months a range of further papers, and before the final white paper, publishing 1 or 2 more that examine other issues, so that there is a full amount of information available. So we'll bring the referendum bill to Parliament in early 2010. It will be a referendum to the highest international standards, and that will give people the chance to choose. I know that the Constitution Unit has talked about not a referendum, but 2 referenda. Well, I have to say I reject that particular concept. The argument has been that once you ask people their view of independence, you better just ask them again just to be sure. It doesn't seem to me to be a basic democratic test. It's like electing a government and once they're elected say, no, we'll give you another chance just in case you're not certain. And there's also been a question about the proposition, that in some sense the proposition is unsure. I think I've given you an indication in what I've said this evening, that there could be no doubt about what the proposition is. The issue of arguing for change in Scotland has not been one generation, it's been several generations. I think there is an absolute clarity in Scotland about what change means. And indeed, one of the major divergences that we see, I think, in politics north and south of the border is the way in which this issue has been at the centre of and is part of the sort of DNA of Scottish politics, in a sense that it isn't south of the border. So I think that the clarity of offering a referendum with a clear proposition, based not only on the white paper argument, but also on generations of discussion and debate in Scotland, is the right thing to do. But also to offer it as a generational opportunity. And the First Minister has been very clear upon that. We're not talking about a never-endum, we're talking about an opportunity for a generation to make that choice. And that's what we hope to offer in 2010. And what will happen if that takes place? Well, it is up to the people of Scotland. They must express their preference. But if they do choose independence within the European Union, then I think we'll see the development of a new social union between Scotland and the rest of the UK. I think we'll see a new relationship of equality emerging. And I think there will be an opportunity for those not in Scotland to find a way forward, to look again at how they organise themselves and how they operate, and to draw some conclusions for themselves. Indeed, perhaps the paradox of independence for Scotland is that it will not only deliver the reform that Scotland so badly needs, but it may well give the opportunity to the rest of this island, or these islands, to reshape their arrangements to ensure that their democracies meet the challenge of the 21st century. What better legacy could there be than that change? Thank you very much.